Okay, so our third speaker is Philip, who's affiliated with MIT and Akamai, working in network measurements and increasingly in internet security.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So this work is about a very different kind of traffic, and that is unsolicited traffic as a result from folks that scan hosts on the internet. Now, what is scanning? Scanning happens when we have a scanner host that sends a large number of packets, typically TCP/SYN packets, to a large number of hosts on the internet with the goal of identifying active services exposed to the internet. Now, this is typically done to identify vulnerable services and devices. So the first step is to scan and to find them. The second step is to exploit these vulnerabilities, be it either to attack the scanned host directly or to leverage infected hosts for amplification attacks or botnets, etc. So in fact, scanning hosts on the internet is really a key component in many of today's cyber attacks, including botnets, amplification attacks, and so on. So tracking this scanning activity in turn can provide us with quite an excellent signal to assess ongoing and potentially even upcoming cyber attacks. And as a result of that, there are several academic as well as commercial services available, I show you some of them here, that track current levels of scanning activity in the internet. Now, what most of these approaches share in common is that they leverage darknets to track scanning activity. Now, a darknet is basically a large prefix that is advertised in BGP, typically by research networks, and then darknets just log all the incoming traffic, but they do never send any traffic out into the internet, hence the term darknet. Now, how do we detect scans with a darknet? Well, this is simple. If you suppose that we have a scanner that sends packets all over the internet, if it does so, sooner or later some of these packets will end up in the darknet, so we can tag this IP address to be a scanner. But there's also an issue here with that, and that is that darknets can only capture what we call naive internet-wide forms of scanning. These are basically two categories. The first one is we have a scanner that really just targets the entire IPv4 space, which is doable with tools like, for example, ZMAP. In that case, we will definitely find the scanner, or we have the case that a scanner targets a large enough random subset of the v4 space. Packets end up in the darknet, we can identify it. So what that basically means is that with darknets, you can detect one particular type of scanners, namely internet-wide scans. But there are other forms of scanners. Now imagine that we have a scanner that does not target the entire v4 space, but only targets very specific prefixes or very specific networks. And we refer to such scanners as targeted scanners. And this is one of the key questions that we want to answer in this work here. So what about targeted scanners? Such scans are currently not documented, and we would argue that targeted scans are potentially much more dangerous when compared to random internet-wide scans, because after all, a scanner executing a targeted scan made an additional effort here, right? So there's more determination to direct your scanning traffic at specific networks instead of just sending it out to the internet. Okay, now before we talk about scanners, I will first introduce you our vantage point, which is a distributed network telescope, and I will show you some of the general statistics of the unsolicited traffic that we log in our telescope. Okay, now in this study, we use firewall logs that were captured at some 89,000 machines that are operated by a major content distribution network. Now, these servers are distributed and hosted in more than 1,300 different autonomous systems, and they're routed within 2,800 routed prefixes. What we now do is that we turn each of these servers into a tiny network telescope, since each machine has a firewall that logs unsolicited traffic directed at these machines. Now, this gives us visibility, of course, into internet-wide scans. They scan the whole internet, they would scan us too. It will also give us visibility into scans that are specifically targeting the CDN or customers of the CDN. But most importantly, and I want to highlight that here, it will also give us visibility into scans that target specific prefixes or networks where we just happen to have CDN caches located. Okay, let me quickly introduce some background on how IP addressing of these CDN machines work. Now, when you request a website that is hosted on the CDN, you will use DNS, and you will issue a DNS request, and then you will be pointed to an IP address of a CDN cache. This IP address is what we call the client-facing IP of our cache. But our machines also have a second publicly routed IPv4 address in the same /24, which we call the operations IP address. And the important thing is that this address is never exposed to any clients using DNS, but we only use it for internal communication. It is, however, publicly routed and reachable. And we can use the distinction of these two types of IP addresses on all of our machines to make inferences about the behavior of specific source addresses that send us unsolicited traffic. And in particular, that means if you have a source IP address that only sends traffic to client-facing IP addresses, we can be quite certain that this source actually learned about us using forward DNS, so it likely targets the CDNs or its customers. If, on the other hand, we have a source IP address that sends unsolicited traffic to both types of these addresses in a 50-50 ratio, then this source does clearly not target domains hosted by the CDN. Okay, now let me show you what kind of traffic we log and use here. Now, of course, the machines here, they're running and they're serving content to clients. And this means that any packets that are going to any port number on our machines where we offer services, which is port 80 and port 443, and a handful of more port numbers, this traffic is directly handled by the web server and its application layer firewall. So we do not have any visibility into any traffic on these port numbers. But we do block all the packets that are sent to inactive port numbers on any of our IP addresses. Like here in this example, we have a host that sends packets on port number 23, but since we do not offer any telnet service, this packet is dropped by a static firewall. It is first dropped, and then we log these dropped packets. There's one exception, and that is if we have the case that one of our machines receives a very large number of these unsolicited packets. For example, as a result of a DDoS attack, if this happens, the machine goes into a burst state, which triggers sampling, meaning in this particular case, we will only log a sample of the unsolicited traffic. Now, we study the potential impact of the sampling in quite some detail in our paper. Here, I just want to give you the bottom line, and that is that in 99.9% of the time, a CDN cache is not in a burst state, meaning we log all the unsolicited packet. And that means that our datasets provides us with almost full visibility into sporadic instances of unsolicited packet, which is the kind of traffic that we would expect when somebody scans through the address space. Now, in terms of dataset, we here focus mostly on the month of November 2018. In total, we logged some 20 billion unsolicited packets, and we already, just when looking at these numbers, find that some 86% of this unsolicited traffic are TCP SYN packets, which is the very first indicator of widespread scanning activity. Okay, now let me show you by example of what the unsolicited traffic that arrives at our machines actually looks like. Now, in this plot here, I show you the number of unsolicited packets that just one example machine of the CDN logged on each day in November 2018. And we split the traffic across client-facing and operations IP address. And what we see here in this case is that the daily log traffic is remarkably stable. And it is also almost perfectly balanced over both IP addresses. And this is an observation we refer to as baseline radiation. And I want to point out that a lot of our machines actually follow this traffic pattern. Now, there are other machines too, of course. So here we have a machine where we only see baseline radiation on the operations IP address, but we see spikes that are targeted only at the client-facing IP address of this machine. We hence refer to this pattern as CDN targeted traffic. And then there's a third case, which is, I think, the most interesting one. Here we have a machine that received more unsolicited traffic than just the baseline radiation, but we see that the traffic is exactly correlated over the client-facing and operations IP addresses. And we refer to such spikes as CDN-agnostic spikes, since they are clearly not targeted at the domain names of our customers. Okay, now I just showed you 3 examples here. I want to point out that they largely cover the individual cases that we see when looking at machines. So one really important observation here is that we see this baseline radiation for all of our machines, as well as some spikes. Okay, but now hold on for a second. So now I'm telling you basically that every IPv4 address that is routed on the internet receives at least these like 3,000 packets on a daily basis, which is what we term baseline radiation. Now the question is, does this really hold? And for that, we use a different data set. We next look at traffic that we collected in a major darknet, namely the /8 darknet that is operated by CADA and UCSD. Now recall, a darknet is basically just a large prefix that logs all the incoming packets. And this particular /8 darknet here has a surface of some 15 million IPv4 addresses. And here in this histogram, we look at the first day of November 2018, and we plot a histogram, the number of packets that each individual destination IP in this darknet logged on this day. And here, this exactly confirms our baseline observation, which means that pretty much all of the IP addresses in this darknet receive precisely some 3,000 packets per day. So we have very few outliers. We have a very uniform distribution of this unsolicited packet to all of these machines. Okay, now this is what we see in a darknet. Now let's have a look at what the distribution looks like when we look at what we see at our machines. Okay, so here in this plot now, I added 2 more lines that show kind of the same distribution, the same day, 1st of November, but now we also look at our IP addresses. Now the first observation is that some of our caches log slightly less. And we studied that and we found that filtering, in network filtering, for example, at AS boundaries, is largely the reason for this observation. But then we again find that a large share of our machines really receive only the baseline radiation, 3,000 packets on any IP address. And then, most intriguingly, we have this heavy tail, where we see many CDN caches that log significantly more unsolicited traffic when compared to the darknet. And the key question here is, what is this additional unsolicited traffic that we see? Okay, so until now it was just about unsolicited traffic. Now let's find out how much of this unsolicited traffic that we log is actually the result of scanning activity, and let's also find out how we can characterize individual scanning strategies. Now we experimented with a lot of different scan detection methods and thresholds in the paper. Here I will just show you our final numbers. So in this work here, we identify a scan, or more precisely, one scanning campaign, if we have a source IP address that contacts more than 100 destination IPs of the CDN with a maximum inter-arrival time of 5,400 seconds between packets. Again, I refer to our paper on more details on why we chose these thresholds, but here I just want to say that using this approach, we are confident that we indeed detect scans. And what we also show with our data is that with this approach, we remove any remaining artifacts of DDoS traffic directed at the CDN machines. Now in total, we find that some 87%, meaning the vast majority of the unsolicited traffic that we log is actually part of scanning campaigns. When looking at, again, at November 2018, we have about 2 million scanning campaigns, some 17 billion packets as a result of scans coming from more than 1 million source IP addresses. Okay, now having identified scans, let's have a closer look at what these scanners actually do. Now, in the first order grouping, we partition scans into 2 categories. On the left-hand side, we have internet-wide scans. These are sources that target the entire IPv4 space. And on the right-hand side, we have targeted scans. These are source IP addresses that direct their traffic at specific IP addresses or specific ranges. Now, let's start with the easy cases. The most simple to identify type of scan are scans of the full IPv4 space. So if you have a scanner IP that targets most or all of our IP addresses, we tag it to be a full scan of the v4 space. Now these days, this is easily doable using tools like ZMap, and overall we find that these full scans contribute some 28% of all the scan packets that we log at our machines. Now the second relatively easy to detect category are scans that we refer to as domain scans. And these are basically scans that target exclusively the client-facing IP addresses of our machines, indicating that these addresses were learned via DNS. And this is the type of scan you would find if, for example, someone scans the Alexa top 1,000 or top 1 million domain names. Overall, we find that these CDN-targeted scans contribute some 4% of all the scan traffic that we log. Okay, now these are the 2 easy cases, but that leaves us with about 2/3 of all the scan packets for which we know it does not target the full IPv4 space, and they also do not seem to target the CDN or its customers directly. And for these remaining 2/3 of the traffic, the question is, do they target a random subset of the IPv4 space, or do they target specific prefixes in specific networks? Okay, now in order to find out if a scan appears to target a random subset, what we do is that we first partition the IPv4 space into /8 bins, which is shown here on the x-axis in this plot. And now we plot the number of CDN machines or CDN IP addresses that we have located within each individual /8. And what we now leverage is the fact that if we have a scan that targets a random subset of the v4 space, this scan will necessarily also target a random subset of our machines. Let me show you this by example. Here I show you one scan, and for this scan we logged some 148 packets. And we plot the distribution of these scanned packets across /8 bins in the red negative direction. And we can see that the targeted /8s correlate precisely with our overall distribution of machines, conforming with the target scanning a random subset of the machines and the space. So we tag this scan to be an internet-wide partial scan. Now in contrast, here I show you a different example of a scan. Here we have a localized scan. Now the machines that this scanner targets are by no means a random subset of our machines, but we see heavy concentration of the scanned packets in 2 of the /8 bins. Now this is basically the methodology. In order to classify that, we now take each scan, we process the scan, we see how well it correlates with our distribution of machines. And here I just quickly show you the result of that. This is a histogram that shows you the Pearson correlation between kind of our machine distribution and the scan traffic. We see a nice bimodal distribution. We have localized scans towards the left with a very low Pearson correlation. And then on the right-hand side, we have scans with a very high Pearson correlation, meaning these scans are internet-wide scans. Okay, now with this method in hand, we can complete our classification of scan target selection strategies. Now in the group of internet-wide scans, we now have an additional category, which are partial internet-wide scans, targeting a random subset of the IPv4 space. Now when we combine full and partial internet-wide scans, in total we find that they make up some 68% of all the scan traffic that we log. But we also have another category now of targeted scans. Having separated out the domain scans already, we are now left with some 29% of scan traffic that we refer to as localized scans. And these scans constitute a new category of target selection, and we scrutinize these localized scans in great detail in our work. So the big news is that about 30% of all the scan traffic that we see is localized, meaning these scanners do not target the space randomly, they do also not target the CDN. So we looked at the addresses that these scans target, and we find that they often target very narrow regions in the IPv4 space. They direct the traffic only at a handful of prefixes or even single prefixes and networks. And in our paper, we show and contrast the different characteristics of these scans. And what we find is that these localized scans have widely different characteristics when compared to random scans of the v4 space, in terms of the services that they target, in terms of the origins of these scanners, in terms of repeated scanning behavior, etc., etc. Now, for the sake of time, I will just present you one very simple and very easy to grasp difference that these localized scans have compared to internet-wide scans. Okay, so here in this plot, I just show you the top 5 port numbers that all scans that we log, no matter which type, target. We see here that scans on port number 23, Telnet, dominate, and we have another large chunk on scans on port 445, and then we have a longer tail of less popular port numbers. Now, if we compare that to what we see in the UCSD darknet, here we see some slight differences. So at the CDN, we do not log traffic on port 80, which seems to be popular in the UCSD darknet. But overall, the distribution of the top 5 port numbers in both of these vantage points pretty much align. We mostly see well-known port numbers of services that have known to be scanned for a long period of time. Right? Folks have been scanning for open telnet machines for many years by now. Okay, but now let's have a look at the top 5 port numbers of localized scans. And here we see a different picture. Here we see suddenly the port 8291 and port 7547, these are heavily targeted by localized scans. And I want to point out at the same time, these 2 port numbers, they do not even appear in the top 50 of targeted port numbers when looking at the darknet or generally in internet-wide scans. And it turns out that these 2 port numbers are related to critical vulnerabilities in home routers, and apparently there are folks out there that are trying to exploit these vulnerabilities really at scale, but they do so exclusively in a targeted way, which basically results in these ports being barely targeted by internet-wide scans, and exploitation attempts are hence severely underestimated when relying, for example, just on a darknet to detect them. Okay, now as mentioned, this is just one of the key differences of these scans. I hope I got you interested to read more about them in our paper. Okay, before I conclude, I want to come to part 3. Now, because we are the CDN, we can make these inferences with this distributed network telescope, but the question is also, can a smaller or even an individual network operator also use this to detect targeted scans? And for that, I want to revisit our baseline observation from earlier. Here I show you just the same machine example that I showed you in the very beginning. We have baseline radiation on both IP addresses. Now that we have this scan classification in hand, we can get a better idea of the composition of this baseline traffic that every V4 address receives. Now let me show you how much of this baseline is actually left if we just remove all the traffic that comes from internet-wide scans, meaning full scans as well as random scans of the V4 space. And this is what is shown here. We now have 2 additional lines that show you the remaining daily unsolicited traffic after we removed all traffic from internet-wide scans. And what we can see is that the baseline is reduced by some 90% after just removing this traffic. This is just one example. Correspondingly, I show you the second machine example featured earlier. Here we see that the traffic level is again shifted by some like 3,000 packets on a daily basis, but the spikes, they do persist after removing these non-targeted scans. So basically what we find is that 90% of this baseline radiation that every V4 address receives every day is a result of internet-wide scans. And what this implies is that this observation is useful to detect targeted scanning activity. So for example, if you want to see if your IP address is targeted, you can do so by first determining the current baseline, the current level of baseline radiation, which we would argue is easily doable using, for example, publicly available data. And then you can check for differences and see if the unsolicited traffic on IP addresses exceeds this baseline. Now, speaking of baseline, here I showed you results for November 2018, where we have a remarkably stable baseline. We looked at how this baseline has evolved over the course of the last 3 years. We see a 3-fold increase in baseline radiation over the course of 3 years, but we still find that it has a stable enough level to use it for such inferences. Okay, with that I conclude. So in this work we have this distributed network telescope, and that allowed us to illuminate some previously undocumented cases of scanning activity. One of the key insights here is the baseline, and that basically means that every routed V4 address receives about 3,000 packets per day just for the fact of being routed, and we find that this is mostly the result of internet-wide scans, and that a deviation from this baseline activity indicates targeted activity. We also developed an adaptable methodology to dissect scanning strategies to find out whether they target a random subset or not. And a key finding here is that about 30% of all the scanning traffic in the internet is the result of localized scans, and that these localized scans show vastly different characteristics when compared to the more widely known internet-wide scans. Okay, that's it. That I conclude.
So you had the plot where you showed that some of your CDN machines are getting more scans than the darknet, but there was sort of a little bump lower in the distribution.
Very low at the distribution. Here, this one?
That little bump off to the left there. Can you say anything about those?
Oh, the one to the very left?
Yeah.
There's like a couple of hundred machines. Yeah, I mean, yes, some of the machines are in maintenance for a couple of hours, and that is basically what results in some of them to receive really much less than that. Another reason would be, but we didn't find evidence of that some of the caches, if they are hosted in a network that for some reason decides to filter pretty much everything that is not port 80 and 443, then we will also not log it.
Nice talk. One question that comes to my mind is that a lot of the bad guys that may actually be out there for scanning for some of the interesting ports may actually know where your network telescopes are, and so intentionally not probe those kinds of address ranges. Did you double check with some additional data besides known darknets that you're really looking at localized scans or just smart scans?
I don't know if I fully understood the question right. So, but basically, as soon as folks know that there is a darknet, they can try to evade that. I believe this is a much greater problem for well-known darknets. Could it be that a person knows about all our IP addresses, including the ones that are never exposed to clients? It could happen. But what we did what we did is that we intersected our inferences with what we see in a real darknet. I mean, we went up to that level. We didn't intersect it with any other data sources.
Yes. One question. Everything here is IPv4, right?
Oh, yes, yeah. Okay.
Here, yeah.
Hi.
So maybe because you don't have so much traffic or because you were comparing to the darknet, do you have an idea about the IPv6?
So we do log unsolicited IPv6 traffic. At the time, November 2018, it is very, very, very little. So we decided to not report on it. So basically, are there folks implementing these early stage IPv6 scanning strategies? I can't give you an answer to that yet. We didn't look into it in detail. It is very little traffic until now.
I mean, could be very interesting, I think, because the devices behind IPv6 are way more vulnerable, I would say. So
yes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, and just one, I guess, final question. The ports seem to be for home routers, and Akamai, the CDN is often hosted in ISP networks. Is it just because they were targeting ISP networks rather than Akamai itself?
That might be the case. Indeed, I mean, a lot of these caches are located in ISPs where if I want to target home routers, I would scan these ISPs. It could be that we attracted them because the machines are located in these specific networks. We didn't go as far as further grouping that down into saying, do we see these home router scans only on caches within ISPs versus ones that we have located outside? But that would be a really interesting next step to do.
Okay, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.